For those of you, I know there's a couple of folks who are super excited for me to get to their favorite part of 1 Thessalonians Chapter 4, talking specifically about the end of time. I'm not doing that today. We'll do that next week. Something else we need to talk about before we get there. The title of my sermon this morning is called Finding Your Sea Legs in the Storm. Last week, I began just the very first, very kind of 13 and 14 of 1 Thessalonians Chapter 4, where Paul is bringing comfort to those whose grief is actually threatening their discipleship and their walk with God. Kind of briefly heard it. We realize that grief that lacks hope within it leads disciples to despair, or anybody actually, a very dark place to be. It's when you can't see the future in front of you. Everything, you can't see any kind of news story. All you see is the repeating. It's a flip mic. Just can't get these mics set. I think there's some kind of interference with our new technology, and so we have to figure out what it is that's doing that. So give 1 second here. Can y'all hear me well, or do we need to turn it up more? Turn it up more, please. Just crank it up. All right. Check 1, 2, 3. Is that good enough? A little louder. You might have to turn the gain and everything up. There we go. Is that a little better? Okay. So again, last week we were talking about how grief can lead to despair, which is a very dark place to be. And the reason we're camping out on grief for last week and for basically 4 weeks, for one, it's kind of a long section in 1 Thessalonians. But second of all, it's been quite a year. Church leaders around the nation, myself, many of us have witnessed what I would call an intense increase in the symptoms of grief that we see in our churches, what we see in our communities and towns. And Brad and I were discussing kind of what we were seeing, I would say a few months ago, and he even turned to me and said, you need to go listen to a podcast where Rick Warren was talking about, back in February, saying to expect a tsunami of grief to hit actually after this COVID kind of started coming to an ease. That's when you would actually start to see the symptoms of the grief. It's kind of like when you have an accident, you don't feel the grief of all of that when you're in the middle of it. You're trying to get through it. You're trying to deal with it. You might feel some grief at early parts of it, but it goes long past the event. And I can tell you, we have seen this happening. Our churches, our towns are hit hard, especially as this pandemic has come to a close. And for all of us, I don't care who you are, it was a time never quite thinking you've got it figured out. A little bit like the microphones this morning. Being out of control. Having things pressed on you this year that you've never had pressed on you. Making decisions that you really didn't have any business making or knowing exactly what was going to happen with them. You tried to make plans, and that fell through almost immediately. I would make a plan on Monday, and by Sunday, the whole world had changed. I mean, constantly up and down, back and forth, to and fro. Lives changed, families changed. And it reminded me of a trip I took this week. On Thursday, Ashley, her brother, father, Brad, TJ, and I decided we were going to go deep sea fishing. And I thought I had prepared the best I could by taking something like Dramamine. I got a good night's sleep. And we take off in the boat at 6 in the morning, and we had barely just left the calm water when I realized that my medication was ineffective and my small breakfast was unwise. Oh, it was a day. Wave after wave mercilessly tossed me all around that boat. I mean, you couldn't even be sick and stable. I mean, it was incredible. The deckhand, he's been out there for a long time and doing boats and stuff for several weeks, and he looked at me like with great pity, and he said, if you can just deal with it for a while, you'll find your sea legs. And I was like, oh, God, I hope I'm not out here that long to find my sea legs. I'd be so happy to feel nothing for just a moment. For just a moment of stillness. I mean, just 30 seconds, 10 seconds even, of complete stillness. I thought, he wants me, I just want to stop feeling this bad. Functioning? That seems like a fantasy, you know? I remember looking at her brother, and he was completely unfazed by it. He was having a ball, had no issues with it. And I was like, man, I wish I could go through this like that. But certain things affect some people one way, and they affect other people another way. But again, what I wanted was a moment of stability, a moment of stillness. I needed a steady rock to stand on for just a moment to gain my composure. I didn't get it until we got back to the shore. Many people have described grief in this same manner. An endless tossing, wave after wave, without the only thing they can do is sleep to get away from it, which is actually what I did on the way back to try to not feel sick for a while. A kind of sickening grief that never ceases. To lose one's sense of hope and direction, really till it sickens the soul. You feel wave after wave. And what we want is Jesus to calm the seas in our life, like the story we read just earlier. Say, Jesus, I really just want you to step up, and I want you to calm the sea of grief or whatever actually storm is going on in my life. But do you remember right what happened after Jesus rebuked the storm? He rebuked the disciples. It's a shocking statement. In Mark, he said it this way: why are you afraid? And how is it that you have no faith? In other words, their faith was not ready for the storm. Their knees were weak, and their spiritual stomachs, if also not their real ones, were in knots. They hadn't found their spiritual sea legs yet to withstand the storms that were going to be coming their way when they were following Jesus. And a lot of times when we're sitting here, we're going, oh, Jesus, you calmed that storm back in the Bible. Why don't you calm mine? His calling is for us to have faith. His promise is not that he's going to calm every storm in our life. He wants you, he wants me to get our spiritual sea legs to make it through the storms of life. And what I want us to do for a few more minutes this morning is talk about how to prepare, on one hand, how to prepare for a storm, or to find your sea legs if you are already in the storm. Even if grief never completely goes away, because sometimes grief does not just end. It may lessen, it may go down, but what Jesus has said is you can find your sea legs. You can find the faith to make it through. So I want to take a moment. Let's read 1 Thessalonians Chapter 4. Let's read how Paul's going to tell them he's teaching the Thessalonians how to get through their grief. He's going to talk about hope, but he's going to give us some direction here for all kinds of grief. 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 through 14. He said this as they were in grief: but we do not want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep or dead, which means passed away, so that you will not grieve as do the rest who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus. Cope with grief by building your relationship with the Lord. Do you prepare or cope with grief by building your relationship with the Lord? You know, people have always, throughout all the centuries, have tried to hold grief at arm's length. They tried to keep it away from them. They try not to ever have to really endure it. And do you know what the Stoics and the ancient, Paul was dealing with these types of thoughts and different philosophies that are all coming back around right now. What they used to say is, If you don't love so much, you won't grieve so much. Put it in our language. To love is to sorrow. And therefore, the conclusion of the Stoics was to do what? Not love so much, not get so engrossed in people, to keep down the positive passions so that the negative ones don't get too high and they don't go up too much. It comes instinctively to us, though, doesn't it? I've seen many people in the middle of grief, and they're just spouting off what they're feeling at the moment. But they have a hard time. They say, I have a hard time ever loving again. I never want to hurt like this again. And I feel for them. I feel a deep compassion for them. And at the same time, I want people to be able to rise again in love. Because that's no Christian answer, is it? That's not, it hardly can be a Christian response to grief. For the ages, looking down, Christians have handled grief. And how we've handled grief has contributed to the expansion of Christianity. The fact that we could help people through grief and come out the other side is one of the early reasons Christianity spread so much. What does Jesus say is the greatest commandments? To love the Lord God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, right? And to love your neighbor as yourself. We are commanded to love. But then, once you've lived a while, you come to realize something very difficult. Our call to love is also a call to sorrow. The more we're investing ourselves in people's lives, the more you will have funerals to go to of loved ones and friends. The more grief you will know. This is hardly surprising, though, when you stop to really think about Jesus, about Christ himself, giving how much he loved you and the suffering and sorrow that has caused him on the cross. That God loved us so much that he sent his only begotten Son for you. That was his grief, his sorrow. That is Christianity in some sense. It's the half we don't talk about very often because we all want to be super excited and super full of love. But when it comes to the grief side of it, oftentimes we're wondering, well, why do I feel so bad? Isn't Jesus and God so full of good feelings? No, it's full of love. And on this side of heaven, it means also sorrow. We know that we are destined as Christians to be a people of sorrow. It's a downer sermon, I get it. But I've done so many trying to lift everybody up for a moment. And we'll get there, and Paul will get there. But you got to take the real road. And the real road for a real Christian who really loves walks through grief. And if it's true, then, if this is all true, then how do we prepare? How do we think through our griefs? How do we talk about them? And the first thing to do is prepare. If you could prepare before you get there, I guarantee you'll have a much easier time. But prepare by grounding our love in God's love, such that he is our greatest love. He has to be your number one greatest love to deal truly with sorrow. We cannot face our sorrows by decreasing our love for others as Christians. We increase our discipleship by increasing our love for God. By investing ourselves more in who he is and what he's doing and what his plan is for our life, even if that's a difficult plan, but you're looking at the end of time as well when you're looking at this. The whole answer to our loves is not to love yourself or others less. Anything good in God's creation, I want to add that. Just love God more than all those things. He still wants us to love what he said is good. He still wants us to love those things. To get rid of sin in your life is not to get rid of everything else in your life and only ever talk about God. I've ran into those people, and it's a little weird. When they hate everything else around them, they hate the world around them so they can love God more. That's not what he says. He says, go and love all I've created, all the people around you, but love me first. And when you get that right, yes, grief will hurt and grief will be full of sorrow and grief will be very real. But with Christ and God first, He is there with you walking. For those who love God, nothing is going to lead you to the darkest fates of despair and leave you there. You will not be left in despair. We are in the hands of a God who loves us and we love Him. In no way I'm pretending that this makes it easy. I don't want anyone to hear that. We can never really answer some of the questions like why that we want answers to. But when you know the Lord, you can trust the why. Because you know His love for you. And why? You can leave in His hands without falling apart quite as much. You know that in Jesus part, right there at the end of verse 14, I'll read that part again. Even so, God will bring with Him those who have fallen asleep. Then it says, in Jesus. That is incredibly critical. I can't explain how critical that is. That is our hope. That is our only hope for eternal redemption of our bodies, but it's more than that. It is in daily practice to say, I am in Jesus, that our own ability to love in the midst of our pain is because we are in Jesus. In Jesus makes all the difference. In Jesus, loving Jesus doesn't mean not being angry with God at times. You might be angry at God at times. You might want to know more, but it means when it comes right down to it, you realize that you are nothing without Him. The point in grief that we reach, talk in my own self, and what I've talked to, and so many who've on greater griefs than I, is coming down to the point in their lives where they realize and answer the question, is Jesus enough for my life? And when they can finally answer yes, healing starts to come with them. He is our King and He is your hope. You know, through the years, this is really important. I want you to get through the years. I thought about telling some stories here, but you know almost everybody I know, so I have to. Most of my stories come from people that I've been around here. I asked people in church how they dealt with some of the griefs that would, to me, seem too much to bear. There were two answers. I'll categorize them in two answers. The first is the more common theme, because we're talking mostly about church people here. They would likely have never made it if they were not already having a deep, trusting relationship with the Lord before the grief hit them. They had built up trust. The love of Jesus and the love He puts through them is something that they dared not live without, a total dependence. And I'm not saying they didn't hurt. I'm not saying it wasn't terrible, but I am saying that was what they said. It's what I would say to you as going through one of my own griefs. I don't think I would have made it if I had not already built up a faithful relationship with the Lord. There's the second kind, and it's more complex, and it fails a lot more often in terms of people actually reaching this point. Since I was talking, again, mostly from people from churches, they realized when they were at the point of grief that they were more in love with the idea of Jesus than they were in love with Jesus. They were more in love with His ethics, the things He taught about how we should treat one another, things of that nature. But they hadn't actually put their heart, their trust, their soul, their strength, their mind into Jesus Christ. They grew up hoping God loved them. But what happened to them is they got to a place, the ones who made it through, they got to a place where they had nothing else really left. And they just cast themselves upon Jesus. And that was all that they had left to do. That was a much harder road. And I would say this, I've seen a lot of folks going through grief and never make it back to discipleship. And most all of those people had what you might call, then talking to him, a very tangential relationship, a very casual relationship with Jesus. He's acquaintance. I like who he is. I like what he does. I like what he stands for. But my challenge to you is there are griefs coming in our lives. Invest yourself more fully, more wholly, and more completely in a relationship with Jesus. And if you are here, if you're online and you're listening and you haven't given your life to Jesus, I have no more advice for you today. All the rest of my sermon is going to be geared to those who are wanting to deepen their relationship with the Lord, who are wanting to understand more fully the Lord and who he is. So I would challenge you this morning, if you need to get your heart right, I'll be down at the front in a little bit, or you can call me this afternoon. You can call me anytime if you're watching online, and we'll talk about getting this part right. But you have to fall in love with Jesus. Are you traveling with Jesus? Has your heart fallen in love with him? Can you cast yourself upon him? He is why. Put it this way. He is why you even have the treasure that you have to grieve. He is the reason that we even have a sorrow at all. You can trust him. The next step to prepare for or cope with grief requires getting our mind right with God, our thoughts right. In other words, we have to have a good idea of who Jesus is, what he did, what he accomplished, who he is now, and what's coming. And if you don't have those clearly thought out, which is what Paul's getting to, then you're going to struggle more in grief than you need to. I can really brush this topic. This is what you would call an expansive topic. We all know that I'm going to kind of put it in an example form for you, this whole section. We all know that there are common symptoms of grief, right? That we all go through in our way, in our time. Different people have different ones, but most of them are fairly biblical. I think they're all biblical. You see people in the Bible, when they lose something, they go through some of these stages of grief. And you have anger, denial, bargaining, depression, and then if you go through that properly, you come to acceptance or something like that. But what I want to do is Paul reaches the very center of the faith. Now, psychology has all these ways that they want to deal with it, and I respect that we sometimes need to go get counseling or get help. And at the same time, I think part of our issue is that we don't actually think very theologically through who Jesus is, what he's done, and ask him to help us through thinking through the death and resurrection. So what Paul does here is he takes them when they're struggling in their grief. Where is the first place he took them? Verse 14, what did it say? For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again. You can start most of your problems with, I have a problem. Jesus died and rose again, therefore, what do I do? Jesus died and rose again. He is now ascended and he is king of the world. What do I do? And we learned a lot of stories in terms of church and Sunday school and different things, but I'm not sure we've done a good job of thinking through theologically how to apply it to our lives. So I want to give you some short examples. I think this will help you out just a little bit. So first, let's take anger. Let's say you're in grief and you're in anger. How would Paul likely talk about and bring resurrection and death and resurrection of Jesus into this? Now, there may be all different types and reasons we all have grief. But I remember Jesus, when Lazarus died, he not only wept, what was he? Angry. He was angry a couple of times. When you start to think about this, God was angry at times. God was angry at a world and evil that brought death and destruction. He was grieving his creation. He was grieving death. He was grieving our deaths. And so when you're angry, and maybe you're even angry with God, God is saying, be angry with me at evil and destruction and death. Be angry with the Lord. We can be so angry at the brokenness that stands in our way of joy. But also our relationships, our calling, our simple hopes for the good, honest life. And we say, you know what, I thought I could expect those things, and I'm angry I didn't get them. And I keep telling, God is not okay with the world. He's on your side. And he did something about it, didn't he? He did something about it. We say, God, why don't you do something about it? He did something about it. He died at the hands of that evil. He gave his life up to destroy death. And he rose again. And Noah, sometimes that doesn't feel like an initial reprieve. But he rose above evil, death, and pain, and we wait for that day of ultimate victory with him. We're going to talk next week a little bit about why he doesn't just come in and fix all your problems and all of our problems right now. But then on the other end of anger, we also find on the cross this thing we all know that's called forgiveness. There on that cross, for all who contributed to evil, all of us who are sinful, if anybody had the right to be angry, it was him, and he forgave us. And we cannot find our way beyond grief for most of the times until we learn to forgive others. And I want to say this, because I think a lot of the anger comes this way, especially the anger at ourselves for what we thought we should do. The anger at ourselves for our failings, the anger for ourselves of not being perfect parents, for our being perfect spouses, being perfect whatever. You have to be able to forgive yourself. And where is that found? Where is the power for that found? The cross and the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus with the promise of his return. It's all right there. Let's take another example, right? Bargaining. Bargaining occurs when we think we can make a deal with God. Like, that's one instance. People go, okay, I'm in a really bad situation. I'm grieving. I'm hurting. So what I would do, maybe I can make a deal with God. You think that maybe you've done something wrong and that God has done this to you for it. And so, some reason, and he's making you pay. So you start to promise to do this or do that and hope that God will bring back your loved one, that he will bring back your job, whatever it happens to be. This got immortalized. Y'all probably, I keep walking away. Y'all probably remember this song from the early 90s. I picked an older song, and I think most of the generations would know. A song called Don't Take the Girl by Tim McGraw. And it was a song where at the end of the last section, his wife is fixing to have a baby, right? But her health is failing. They're afraid that the mother is fixing to pass away. And in this very sweet way, the husband hits his knees and begins to promise. He begins to pray. He says, don't take her, take me instead. He just keeps making bargains with God and saying, I'll do anything not to lose her. I would rather die myself. It's a sweet, wonderful song and completely theologically wrong. It all seems to work out very nicely in the song. It leads a lot of people to think, and that's how, not just that song, but a lot of people learn to think that way. That's not a theological way to think, especially not for those who already trust Jesus. So let's think through the death and resurrection of Jesus. What he's offering, what we're offering, is to substitute ourselves for something, for life, for something else. We're going to make a substitution. In Jesus on the cross, when you get to that, you realize that substitution for life is already made. And it's not made just to bring us back to a broken, destroyed world that's full of corruption. It's a substitution to offer you eternal life. A substitution that is far greater than any offer you could ever put on the table. He put it on the table. Jesus put himself on the table to substitute for our brokenness, to substitute for our griefs, to substitute for us. And he promises this return and this resurrection for those who believe in him. Isn't that amazing to think of it that way? Every time you want to make a deal with God, you can't beat the deal he already made for you in your place. It's silliness. And to the point of just going, I am so small. And he's done such a wonderful thing for me. And I am broken because I love. But he loves me more, and I'm going to trust that he can make this right. So when we get to thinking, I'd do anything, it's like reading God's own mind, and he did it for you. See, these are not simple. I don't want to give this away, that thinking through this will give you some kind of simple mental pill that's going to better instantly make you feel better, right? It's this in Jesus again. In Jesus, we depend on the Holy Spirit to make these truths become real in our heart. Me saying this does not penetrate it to your heart. I want to get it to your head, and trust the Holy Spirit to get it to your heart. I could go on and apply the cross and the resurrection to all kinds of different areas of denial or depression or other areas of grief we face. But once we come to terms with God, in terms that God is on our side, once we realize and we really come to this deep knowledge that God is on our side, we can change our questions. This is important. How many of you, and I would include myself in this, how many of you can nod and say that you've known some grief, really deep grief? Just nod to me. I'll raise my hand. Just nod to me. How many of you have also asked God the question, why? I have. Why? Why did God do this? Me and Brad were talking about this sermon, and Brad pointed out to me the other day, I think in a very mature development of the faith or of your particular grief, is when you can learn to ask God how when you want to ask him why. You start to ask him, God, how do I get through this? Because now I don't have to ask why as though he's my enemy or someone he has to answer to. But God, how do I get through this? How do I know what decision to make now? What do I do with my life? It's to say that that's the kind of question you would ask to somebody who's on your side. I know there can seem a vast emptiness even when you ask God how for some time, and it can seem dark. But keep asking Jesus what he has for you. Keep searching the scriptures and praying. I also realized that on the other end, I'll talk about this in depth next week, we ask God how when we should ask him why. We get it flip-flopped. And again, that's what we'll talk about next week. When it comes to the end of time, we all want to know how, all the details. But Paul doesn't give us all the details. He tells us a why, a very big why. And so I want to encourage you to think, especially this week, though, on switching your mindset. God is on my side. How? How? So finally, let God turn your grief into a time of deepening your discipleship. Do you think God can use grief to deepen your discipleship? It's kind of a big point of Christianity, isn't it? I mean, we say it all the time. But I'll tell you this, not all suffering brings growth. You need to hear that loudly. Not all suffering brings growth. Only the suffering you take to Christ. Suffering has been the fall of many people. And if suffering just made people wiser, and if it just made people better, wouldn't we have a pretty wise and wonderful world? It doesn't happen that way. It's not automatic. Your suffering does not lead to discipleship unless you give that grief to the Lord and walk with him in it. I want you to be wiser and closer to God through your trials. I think of James. That's the one that comes to mind. This applies in so many different areas, but James says this. He says, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God." In other words, go to him with what your trials are, right? "Who gives generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But he must ask in faith without doubting. For the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind." Those who are not giving themselves over to the Lord, who are not taking and seeking that advice and saying, "God, I trust you," just like I said a minute ago, saying, "I know that you're on my side." If we don't know that God is on our side, you will be tossed around by the world, tossed like the sea, like I was this last week. Are you feeling tossed by the wind and the surf and the sea until it's making you soul sick? When my mind goes back to the image of the disciples, all panicking on the storm-tossed sea, they forgot to realize that Jesus was there the whole time. The one. I mean, they knew he was there in some sense, but they forgot who he was and what they meant. They had not figured that out yet. You know what Jesus was doing? Sleeping, resting. Why? Because he trusted the Father to know that he would keep his promises. Whatever storm you're going through, Jesus is with you. That ship may be tossed about. It may be turning, and it may be difficult, and it may be giving you the trials of your life. But take time to get your sea legs. Jesus is on the boat with you. This is one reason I really want to encourage you and convince you to get all your children, encourage your children and grandchildren in the church as best as you can. It's not, going to church and accepting Jesus is not just a way to heaven, though it certainly is the critical one. But it's also preparing their faith for the reasonable assumption your children, grandchildren, mine as well, will experience grief and sorrow. You and they need to know God is there while they're still fighting smaller battles before they have to go fight their big battles. I want to encourage you today to take whatever griefs and sorrows you have and give them to the Lord, knowing that he can build you up. You don't have anything he needs, nothing that you can offer to him except yourself, your faith. Give your heart to him, and he gives gladly. He is on your side, even in the storm-tossed days of your life, full of wisdom and hope.